Imagine finding out that your beloved daughter abandoned you and spent $22,000 on a vacation with her in-laws. Sounds generous, doesn't it? But here's the twist. That money was mine. Strange, right? Sit down and let me tell you the rest of this story, which will surely surprise you even more. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. I stood on the porch with my hand on the railing, watching Danica haul the last suitcase into the back of the SUV. Landon was already in the passenger seat, adjusting his sunglasses, her mother tucked behind her with a scarf tied tight beneath her chin like she was boarding a yacht, not a car. Danica slammed the trunk closed and turned to me with a quick, distracted smile. "Thanks for keeping things going here, Dad. The orchids will need water. Oh, and the drip line near the roses was acting up. You know what to do." She said it like I was the hired help, like this was just another weekend chore to tick off her list. I nodded without speaking. My throat felt dry. My fingers curled around the edge of the porch rail to steady myself. "No cell service at the resort," Landon chimed, not even looking at me. "We'll be off the grid for a bit, good for the soul." Her mother gave me a small wave as the engine started, a half smile like she was doing me a favor just by acknowledging my presence. I watched the vehicle crunch down the gravel path, dust rising behind it until the taillights disappeared around the bend. The silence after they left was loud. I turned back toward the house. On the fridge was a handwritten note in Danica's all-caps scrawl. "Don't forget to water the conservatory plants." Below it, the thermostat was turned up to 78. She always hated the way I kept it cool. The dining table still held the printouts from their trip itinerary, exclusive gallery viewings, private yacht charters, a gourmet cooking class for couples. I pulled out my chair, the one with the leather cushion I'd sewn years ago, and sat down slowly. Later that evening, I opened our family group chat. Photos of the road trip had already begun. "Island bound," the caption read. Everyone had clicked the heart emoji. No one had written to me. I folded the dish towel in my lap and walked outside into the evening light toward the ancient oak tree I once planted with hope. The next morning, I reached for my pruning shears, the good ones with polished steel and the etched initials my wife once engraved for me back when she thought small details made love visible. But they were gone. I checked the shelf above the tools, then the back hooks on the shed wall. Nothing. In their place was a dull pair with one blade rusted completely. It took me longer than it should have to piece it together. Landon had slipped them into his canvas bag the day before, mistaking, or perhaps not mistaking them for his. I remembered now watching him carry it out to the SUV, the bulge of something metallic at the top. I pressed my lips together and slid the worn shears on anyway. The branches didn't care about polish. The weeds didn't ask for engraving. Out by the orchid beds, the drip line Danica mentioned was indeed sputtering. I crouched low to adjust the coupling and felt the ache settle in my knees like a warning. The hose hissed once, then steadied. Across the fields, the sun broke through the morning haze and caught the rim of the vineyard, lighting up the old stone wall in pale gold. I moved slowly toward the western plots, past the small trellis where my wife used to tie grapevines with old cloth strips. I hadn't had the heart to replace the ties. Some of them still fluttered there, frayed but loyal. A breeze swept past and the sharp scent of jasmine rose up. Wild jasmine growing in the cracks between the flagstones. Leora had planted it once for my headaches, laughing as she warned me it would take over everything. I knelt beside it and pinched off a sprig, rubbed it between my fingers until the oil coated my skin. Then I sat back on my heels, staring out over the land that had fed us, cradled us, held our grief and celebrations alike, the land that was still mine. When I walked back toward the house, I passed by the kitchen window and noticed something strange sticking out of Danica's desk drawer. The paper corner poking from the drawer was yellowed and curled. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another gardening catalog or old receipt. But something about it felt wrong. I opened the drawer fully, careful not to make the wood creak, and pulled it free. An investment portfolio packet, not mine, new. The names on the front, Danica Sterling and Landon Cross. No mention of me. Stapled to the front was a handwritten sticky note in Landon's looping cursive. Needs updating after Dad signs. I stood there holding it like it was a snake, like it would hiss and bite if I blinked. The date on the policy was 3 weeks old. That meant the meeting with the notary last month, the one Danica framed as a small formality for emergency access, wasn't so small. I placed the packet back exactly where it was. Then I folded my hands and stood still, breathing through the weight in my chest. Later that afternoon, Della from next door stopped by with a jar of homemade preserves. She'd been doing that ever since I lost Leora. She always said it was nothing, just a bit of comfort. She chatted as I ladled water into the base of the old oak. At one point, she laughed and said, "Danica was saying you're about ready to pass the estate to her soon. That's exciting." My hand paused midair. I kept my voice level. "Is that so?" "Oh yes," she said brightly. She was talking about redesigning the vineyard, turning part of it into boutique guest houses. Said you were ready to retire from the land. I smiled at her, but it didn't reach my eyes. After she left, I stood in the kitchen, hands on the counter, eyes fixed on the old family photo above the sink. The one where Danica, age 8, was covered in mud and grinning like a wild thing. I had never once said I'd hand the estate over, but apparently my silence had become their strategy. I walked to the study, opened my laptop, and signed into the estate account dashboard. The file box was heavier than I remembered. Dust clung to the top like it had settled in layers undisturbed for years. I opened it on my lap and slowly flipped through the manila folders, each one labeled in Leora's steady handwriting. Deeds, water rights, vine suppliers, old land surveys from the 1990s, everything in order. Everything kept like a woman who understood that what you build should last beyond you. Tucked in the back was the ledger, our old way of recording purchases before everything went digital. Leora never trusted the bank entirely. I hadn't opened the book since her funeral. My hands trembled a little as I did now. The last entry was mine. July 1st, memorial flowers, paid cash. She wouldn't have wanted a bill for goodbye. I added a new one beneath it, August 15th. Found extravagant charges on the estate account. Santa Barbara Resort, $3,200. Private jet charter, $18,000. Spa treatments, $900. Signed by Danica. I shut the ledger and set it down. The numbers weren't the point anymore. It was what they represented. Not just the money, but the assumption that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't mind, wouldn't say a thing, that I'd stay quiet in the garden while they turned the fruits of my labor into champagne-soaked beach days. By nightfall, I had relogged into the banking system and opened every connected account. Danica had quietly rerouted the main credit card to her profile. She had access to my emergency fund, too. I removed her from both. The system warned me this action may impact authorized users. I clicked proceed. Then I went outside with a lantern and sat beneath the arbor. The jasmine still crept at the edges of the stones, undeterred by boots or storms or people who thought they knew better. The moon was full that night. I watched it rise and felt the edges of myself settle. At 6 a.m. the next morning, my phone buzzed sharp against the windowsill. I picked it up, recognizing the number before I even touched the screen. Danica's voice hit before I said hello. "Dad, something's wrong with the cards. None of them are working. We can't pay for anything. We tried the resort bill, groceries, even the car rental." She paused, waiting. When I didn't respond right away, she added with a nervous laugh, Did the bank mess up? You might need to call them. I took the kettle off the stove. It wasn't whistling yet, but I could feel it boiling. I made some changes, I said softly, letting the words hang. Wait, what? I adjusted the accounts, I said. Removed your access. There was a stretch of silence on the line and then the sound of Landon in the background. Sharp, panicked, something about their dinner reservations. Dad, she said again, now lower, angrier. You can't just do that without telling me. We had plans. I noticed, I replied. She started to speak, but I hung up. I poured the hot water over the jasmine I'd gathered the night before. The scent rose quickly, comforting and familiar. Then I stepped out onto the porch with my mug, letting the early sun warm my shoulders. From where I stood, I could see the conservatory plants, row after row of newly sprouting greens. I hadn't watered them yet. Let them wait. I walked the path toward the rose bushes where a few branches had bent under their own ripening weight. Leora used to prop them with split wooden stakes tied gently with old cloth strips. I found one of her old supports still lying near the fence, weathered but solid. I lifted a branch and wedged it beneath, careful, deliberate. Some things needed support, others needed pruning, and some just needed to be cut off at the root. Later that afternoon, I took out my address book and flipped through names I hadn't read in years. One stood out. Tamsin Vash, attorney at law, Leora's old friend, mine too. Once, I picked up the phone and dialed. Tamsin still answered her own phone. Her voice hadn't changed, firm, measured, the kind of tone that let you know she read every line of every contract and never once missed a clause. Corwin, she said, it's been a while. We met the next morning at her office, a converted carriage house behind what used to be the city library. She opened the door wearing work boots with fresh streaks of mud and held a mug that said, "Trust me, I read the fine print." I smiled in spite of myself. We sat at the long table near the back where sunlight filtered through lace curtains. I laid out the folder with the investment packet, the bank printouts, and a copy of the original deed Leora and I had signed in 1995. Tamsin didn't ask for gossip. She asked for facts, and I gave them to her quietly, directly. When I was done, she took off her glasses and leaned forward. Do you want to disinherit her, Corwin? No, I said, I want to redirect. We worked for nearly 3 hours. By the time I signed the draft papers, the framework was clear. The estate would be placed in a living trust under my full control. In the event of my death, all proceeds and property would transfer to the Sterling Agricultural Fellowship, a scholarship fund for young farmers across the state. Danica and Landon's names were nowhere in it. Tamsin slid the final draft across the table. This will hold legally and financially. You're not erasing your legacy, Corwin, you're preserving it. I nodded. On the way out, I passed by the office bulletin board. Tacked between notices and faded clippings was a photo of Leora and Tamsin taken during the land zoning battle 25 years ago. They were standing in front of the county building, smiling like rebels with paperwork. I drove home with the windows down, the breeze lifting the edge of the new deed folder on the passenger seat. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, my voicemail light blinked. I pressed play. The voice was deep, commanding, and laced with disbelief. This is Landon's father. I thought we had an understanding. Danica said everything was set, that you were finally handing things over. We booked the private jet upgrade based on that. You can't just freeze the cards now, you need to fix this. This was supposed to be the year she transferred the deed. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask if I was all right. He never called me by name. I saved the message. Then I forwarded it to Tamsin with the subject line, "Intent to defraud." Afterward, I stepped outside and walked down to the grape arbor Leora built with her own hands the year after Danica was born. The vines were curling upward again, thicker than last year, the weight of summer already pressing into their skin. I sat on the bench beneath them and let the filtered light fall across my lap. I thought about how quickly entitlement grows when you water it with assumption. They hadn't just expected the land, they'd made plans for it, booked upgrades, rewritten the future as if I were already a ghost. I ran my hand along the smooth armrest, remembering the day Leora and I planted the first vine. We had no money back then, just dirt and vision. Every nail in that arbor was a wish we hammered into the wood. She'd said, "This land will outlive both of us if we treat it right." So I would. Inside the house, I lit a burner under the kettle and wrote a single note to myself. Do not explain. Do not apologize. Let silence do its work. That evening, I walked the fence line, checking posts, clearing fallen branches. When I reached the east gate, something caught my eye. A rental car idling by the road. Danica alone. I didn't move. She didn't get out. She stayed in the car for a long time, then drove away without turning around. The next morning, I saw her footprints in the gravel leading up to the gate and stopping short of the lock. She returned that afternoon. No car this time. She must have left it at the fueling station and walked the last stretch. I spotted her through the screen door, standing by the east fence like she didn't quite know how to approach. She was in loafers, not work boots. Her shirt damp with sweat and her eyes darting like she expected someone else to answer for all this. I didn't speak. I walked down the steps with a shovel in hand and crossed the yard until I reached the inside of the gate. Then I opened it slowly, stepped through, and held the shovel out. Not roughly, not kindly, just held it. If you need something from this land, I said, start here. Her brow furrowed. What is this, some kind of punishment? No, I said, it's the only transaction left. She stared at the shovel, then at me. Behind me, the wind picked up the dust from the road and turned it loose. She didn't reach for the handle. You're being cruel, she said. I tilted my head. I'm being clear. She looked smaller. Then I saw it just for a second, that flicker of the girl who used to run barefoot through the irrigation ditches and fall asleep under the fruit trees. But that girl had grown into a woman who thought ownership passed with assumption. Landon's father already put money down on a design firm, she muttered. We had plans. You didn't even warn us. I'm not required to warn you, I said. Especially when you didn't ask permission to spend what wasn't yours. She didn't argue. She turned without a word, hands clenched, and walked back down the road the way she came. I set the shovel upright in the dirt and leaned on it, watching the gravel settle in her wake. That evening, I harvested peaches from the southern tree line, more than I'd expected this early in the season. I boxed a few for the farmer's market, then slipped the rest into baskets for the scholarship students due to visit next week. At sunrise, the newspaper was waiting in the mailbox. The headline took up half the page. Sterling Estate launches fellowship for young growers statewide. There was a photo of me standing beside the new greenhouse, arm lightly resting on the frame. 3 students beside me, one smiling shyly, the other 2 beaming into the sun. The article mentioned the acreage, the legacy, the mission. It said nothing of the cards frozen or the daughter omitted. It didn't need to. I sat on the porch swing with my tea, reading it twice. Once as a man still healing from a quiet betrayal. Once as the steward of something bigger than one family's entitlement. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. Landon had unfollowed me. Danica had posted a black screen with the caption, "Lesson learned, don't trust anyone. Not even blood." I didn't reply. Instead, I took the clipping and pinned it inside the kitchen cupboard, right next to Leora's recipe for heirloom tomato soup. She would have smiled at the scholarship. She would have called it good ground returning good fruit. Around noon, one of the fellows, Lyra, arrived early to prep for the weekend. She brought fresh seedlings and asked if I had more compost. I showed her to the bin and we spent the better part of an hour discussing root systems and weather tolerance. She didn't ask about Danica and didn't need to. When she left, I walked the perimeter of the vineyard and paused near the bench beneath the arbor. From there, I could see the entire upper field. The soil had darkened with the season, richer now, more forgiving. Danica's shadow no longer lingered over it. That night I baked cornbread and added thyme from the conservatory plants. As it cooled, I drafted a letter to the scholarship board suggesting we expand the program next spring. The kitchen smelled like harvest, like permanence. I folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and placed it near the door. In the morning, I would walk it to the mailbox myself, past the rows of peaches nearly ready to fall into waiting hands. The mornings have grown quieter, but not empty. I wake before the sun crests the ridge, brew my tea, and step out barefoot onto the cool porch boards. The air smells of ripening fruit and turned soil, a scent I used to associate with long days and aching limbs. Now it feels like clarity. The peaches in the southern rows are heavy this year, pulling branches low with their weight. I've begun tying them with soft cloth strips to keep them from snapping. Leora used to joke that our vineyard was full of trees that didn't know their own strength. I think she meant me too. The scholarship students return each weekend now, one by one. They bring notebooks, questions, sometimes music. I let them learn by doing, planting, harvesting, fumbling through mistakes, and laughing as they grow. I don't hover. I simply make space. That's something I've learned. Legacy isn't in what you control, but what you're willing to release to the right hands. Danica hasn't come back. Not in person. She sent a message once, short and sour. I hope you're proud. I didn't reply. Not because I wasn't, but because her bitterness wasn't mine to soften. This land doesn't belong to silence anymore. It belongs to stories retold in rows of seedlings, in compost stirred by calloused fingers, and sweat earned honestly under late summer skies. I walk the fence line now without flinching. The east gate no longer feels like a threshold between conflict and peace. It's just wood and wire holding shape like I do. Weathered but never weak. In the corner of the vineyard beneath the arbor, I've placed a new bench, not to replace the old, but to mark a beginning. On it, I've carved a line Leora once said, "When the estate was still young, plant what outlasts you." This morning, I sat there with my tea and watched the students carry baskets back to the greenhouse. One turned and waved. I lifted my hand in return, palm steady. They left me to plant, and without knowing it, they gave me everything I needed to bloom. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.